From the moment the girl's father married again, her world shifted into one of shadows and sorrow. She had been a gentle child, quiet in her ways, graceful in her movements, and full of dreams that belonged to the innocence of her age. Yet her stepmother saw none of this as beauty or worth. Instead, she saw it as weakness, something to be taken advantage of, something to trample upon until no spark remained. In the beginning there were small cruelties, little acts of disdain disguised as care. She was given the least food, the smallest share of water to drink, and when the others sat together in warmth, she was sent outside to fetch wood or draw water, even in the cold nights when her thin clothes did little to shield her. Day after day the weight of endless chores pressed down upon her small shoulders. From dawn until long after sunset, her hands were never still. She scrubbed pots blackened with soot until her knuckles bled, swept floors until the straw broom frayed, and carried buckets of water so heavy that her back ached for hours afterward. Yet no word of thanks was ever given. Instead, the stepmother's voice followed her like a lash, sharp and cruel, cutting into her spirit more than any blow could. "Lazy girl," the woman would sneer, though the girl had not rested for hours. "Useless thing," she spat, even as the girl's hands trembled with exhaustion. When the stepmother's own children laughed and played, the girl was never allowed to join. She could hear their giggles while she bent over piles of laundry, her small fingers rubbed raw against rough cloth. They would run through the house with food in their hands, roasted maize, fried plantains, sweetened porridge, dropping crumbs carelessly as if abundance was their birthright. She, meanwhile, was forbidden from even licking the spoons after cooking. Many nights, she went to bed with an empty stomach, curling herself into a corner and biting her lip to keep from crying too loudly, for every sob was met with harsher punishment. Insults rained down on her daily, breaking her sense of belonging piece by piece. "You're nothing," her stepmother hissed whenever she faltered. "Not even worth the dust under our feet." The words were meant to bury her spirit in shame, to make her believe she was as worthless as they claimed. And when words failed to satisfy the stepmother's cruelty, there were blows. A slap when she moved too slowly. A shove when she stumbled. Sometimes the woman's hands would twist her ear or drag her by her arm until bruises bloomed on her skin. The pain was sharp, but it was the humiliation that stung deeper, the knowledge that no one came to her defense, that in this house she was alone against the storm. The villagers who saw her sometimes pitied her, but pity was a hollow thing. None dared to intervene, for the stepmother had a tongue like fire and the cunning to turn truth into lies. "She deserves it," the woman would say to those who questioned her harshness. "She is a cursed child, lazy and defiant. If I do not discipline her, she will bring ruin to us all." And the villagers, afraid of being tangled in another family's affairs, looked away, letting the girl suffer unseen. Her days blurred into one another, an endless circle of work, hunger, and sorrow. She rose before the first rooster crowed, her small hands shaking in the chill of morning as she swept the compound. By the time the sun set, her body was stiff and aching, her eyes heavy with fatigue. Still, her stepmother would find fault in something. A pot not polished enough. A floor not scrubbed to perfection. A task completed yet never good enough. For each imagined mistake, she paid in insults or blows, learning quickly that in this household, perfection itself could not shield her from cruelty. Yet despite the torment, there was something unbroken in her. At night, when her stepmother thought her too weary to even think, she whispered to herself in the dark. She whispered the memory of her real mother's songs, faint but still alive in her heart. She whispered prayers to the ancestors, begging for strength to endure another day. And sometimes, when the tears she tried so hard to hide finally fell, she wiped them quickly, not wanting her stepmother to see them and mock her further. Even in the midst of endless cruelty, the girl clung to a sliver of dignity, refusing to let despair consume her fully. Her stepmother's malice seemed boundless. On festival days, when the villagers dressed in bright clothes and feasted together, the girl was hidden away, forced to clean while the others danced. On nights of storytelling, when laughter echoed through the compound, she was sent to the shadows, her ears straining to hear the tales she was not allowed to join. She was treated as less than a servant, because at least a servant could expect wages or food in return for labor. She received only scorn. Still, within her suffering, the seeds of something greater were being planted. Each insult taught her the depth of cruelty humans could hold. Each blow carved into her memory the injustice of the world. And each day she endured gave her a strength she did not yet understand, a strength that grew silently, like roots deep beneath the earth. Though the stepmother believed she was breaking her down, she was instead shaping the girl into something unyielding, something that, when the time came, would rise with a force beyond human comprehension. For now, though, the girl bore her suffering in silence. She did not yet know what destiny awaited her, nor how her tears, her pain, and her innocence would one day transform into fire. All she knew was that her stepmother's cruelty was endless, and her own endurance was the only shield she had. And so she bent under the weight of her burden, but she did not break, though the world around her seemed determined to see her shattered. At night, when the house finally grew quiet and the voices of laughter and scorn were replaced by silence, the girl would retreat into the small corners where no one could see her. It was in these secret places that she allowed her sorrow to flow, no longer able to hold it inside her frail chest. Her eyes, already swollen from long days of humiliation, brimmed with tears that she tried to wipe away quickly, but they came again and again, unstoppable, like a river that refused to dry. Each drop slid down her cheeks and fell into the earth beneath her, darkening the dust, leaving faint trails of her grief upon the ground. She thought of them as nothing more than tears, signs of weakness, evidence of her despair, but the world around her did not see them as ordinary. The earth, silent and patient, drank her tears with a hunger of its own. It had long been waiting for such sorrow, for such pure pain to soak into its roots. The soil remembered the cries of generations past, of children wronged, of women silenced, of innocence abandoned. Each time her tears fell, it was as if she was adding her voice to an ancient song, a song that whispered through the veins of the ground, carrying her grief deeper and deeper until it touched forces long hidden from human eyes. Her nights of secret crying were endless. When she bent over her chores, the sharp sting of insults ringing in her ears, she clenched her jaw to keep the tears from falling in front of others. But in solitude, when darkness shielded her, she wept openly, her shoulders trembling, her hands covering her face. The sound of her sobs was muffled by the stillness of the night, yet the wind seemed to carry them into the unseen. Sometimes as she cried, she felt the air shift gently around her, as if something unseen brushed past her skin, listening, gathering her grief as though it were something precious. What she did not know was that each tear was not wasted. Each droplet carried more than sorrow. It carried her innocence, her endurance, and the truth of her suffering. The earth, the air, and the hidden veins of the land absorbed this truth, and with it they stirred. Roots deep in the soil quivered as though waking from a long sleep. Stones buried for centuries hummed faintly, touched by the rawness of her despair. The air above her shifted, not with the ordinary wind but with whispers, almost too soft to hear, like voices pressing through the veil of the world. She remained unaware of this awakening. To her, the nights of weeping were her only release, the only place where she could pour out the pain she dared not show during the day. Her tears felt like defeat, like the proof that her stepmother had broken her spirit. Yet the more she cried, the more something unseen was gathering strength, coiling itself in silence, waiting for the moment to rise. Sometimes as her tears soaked the ground, she noticed odd things. The soil beneath her seemed warmer than before, almost as though it pulsed faintly with life. A faint glow lingered on the edges of her vision when she looked down too long. The air around her felt heavier, charged, as though unseen eyes were fixed on her from the darkness. At first, she told herself it was her imagination, the result of too much sorrow clouding her mind. But night after night the feeling grew stronger, undeniable. There were moments when, in the midst of her sobbing, she thought she heard sounds, low murmurs like voices carried on the wind. They did not speak in clear words, but they soothed her, steadying the tremble in her chest. Other times, she swore the earth beneath her seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting softly, as though the soil itself was alive and listening. She would touch the ground with her palm, feeling its roughness against her skin, and a strange comfort would settle in her heart, quieting her despair, if only for a moment. Still she did not understand. She thought herself weak, forgotten, a child left at the mercy of cruelty. She did not know that her tears, which she believed were signs of helplessness, were seeds of power. She did not know that the earth and sky were awakening because of her, recognizing her sorrow as something sacred, something that deserved an answer. Her stepmother, smug in her cruelty, never suspected that the very suffering she inflicted was sowing the roots of her own downfall. Each insult, each blow, each denial of kindness only pushed the girl deeper into her quiet grief, and each moment of grief poured more tears into the ground. The stepmother thought she was breaking the girl, but she was instead calling forth forces she could neither see nor control. And so, night after night, the girl wept, her tears forming a river unseen by human eyes. A river that ran not across the surface but through the hidden veins of the world. It carried her pain into the silence of the earth, where ancient forces stirred restlessly. It carried her sorrow into the currents of the air, where whispers gathered like clouds before a storm. She did not yet know that her tears were no longer just hers. They had become a summons, a calling that would soon be answered. Her stepmother believed that no one heard the girl's cries. The villagers turned their faces away, thinking her suffering was hers alone to endure. But the land had heard, the spirits had heard, and even the shadows of the night had listened. The girl's tears, born of cruelty, had become the thread that tied her to something far greater than herself. She did not know it yet, but the river of her tears would soon flood into power, and her suffering would no longer remain silent. The nights of the girl's sorrow stretched long, but she was never truly alone, even if she thought so. The earth had already begun to stir, but now the living world around her joined in, silently bearing witness to the weight of her pain. When she cried, it was not only the ground that drank her tears, it was as though everything alive nearby listened, absorbed and responded in its own way. The trees, tall and weathered by many seasons, stood as guardians in the distance. On nights when she pressed her face into her hands, her sobs muffled, the branches would bend toward her as if straining to listen. Leaves rustled without the faintest breeze, a soft shiver echoing her anguish. Sometimes, after long hours of weeping, she would notice fallen leaves scattered around her feet, though no wind had blown to shake them down. The elders might have said it was coincidence, but the truth was different. The trees, rooted deep in the soil that drank her tears, trembled with her grief. Animals too began to stir in unusual ways. Stray dogs and lean cats that normally kept their distance from the house appeared in the night, lingering in the shadows. Their glowing eyes watched her silently, not with hunger but with a strange solemnity, as though they too mourned. Sometimes, when her tears fell too heavily, one of the dogs would howl mournfully into the night, its cry carrying her sadness across the village. Birds that usually slept in the branches nearby woke at odd hours, their wings fluttering restlessly as if stirred by unseen hands. Even the insects, the crickets, the cicadas, paused their songs whenever her sobs grew loudest, offering silence as a form of reverence. The wind was perhaps the most faithful of her companions. On nights when she thought no one in the world could hear her, the air shifted suddenly. Gentle currents brushed her cheeks as though trying to dry her tears, whispering faint comforts in a language she could not understand but felt deep in her bones. Sometimes the wind would lift her cries, carrying them far across the village and beyond. A villager awake in the late hours might hear what sounded like weeping carried on the night air, but when they stepped outside they found nothing but shadows and silence. They shook their heads, uneasy but unwilling to believe. The villagers began to notice other signs too. Chickens clucked nervously at night, refusing to settle. Goats that grazed near the house often turned their heads toward the girls' quarters, stamping their hooves as though sensing something uncanny. Even the river that ran not far from the village seemed to shift its currents when her sorrow was greatest, its ripples carrying a mournful song. But people dismissed these happenings, refusing to connect them to the innocent child living under cruelty. They told themselves that animals were unpredictable, that winds rose without warning, that rivers sang in many moods. To believe otherwise would mean acknowledging that something greater was unfolding, and that thought frightened them more than ignorance comforted them. Yet the signs only grew stronger. There were nights when the villagers swore the trees near the stepmother's compound whispered, their branches groaning like voices carried by the breeze. Others claimed they had seen owls gather in unusual numbers, watching the stepmother's home with unblinking eyes. A few muttered that when they drew water from the well, the surface sometimes rippled without cause, as though disturbed by invisible tears falling from above. But each time someone spoke, others silenced them with nervous laughter, eager to call it coincidence, eager to turn away from the truth. The girl, lost in her grief, was unaware of how deeply her sorrow reached. To her, the animals' eyes glinting in the night seemed no more than passing shadows. The rustle of leaves felt like nothing more than the stir of air. The wind's gentle brushes she mistook for chance, and the howling dogs she thought were simply wild creatures going about their ways. She never imagined that her sadness had bound the living world around her to her heart, that they had become her silent witnesses, carrying her pain where human ears refused to hear. But the spirits knew. And the animals, the trees and the winds, all tied to the ancient rhythms of the land, were closer to the spirits than the villagers who had closed their eyes. They were not just watching, they were carrying her grief, amplifying it, spreading it across earth and sky. Each howl, each rustle, each whisper of wind was a message, a warning, an omen of what was to come. The villagers, though they pretended not to believe, felt uneasy in their hearts. Children woke from nightmares, saying they dreamed of rivers of tears running through the streets. Old women stirred at night and claimed to hear voices in the trees calling out in sorrow. Farmers muttered under their breath when their goats grew restless without reason, but they dared not speak too loudly, fearing they might invite the same unseen forces into their lives. And so, even as they dismissed the signs with nervous laughter, they carried a seed of dread inside them, a seed that would grow when the truth could no longer be denied. The girl's tears had not gone unnoticed. Though the stepmother turned away, though the villagers silenced their doubts, the world itself had become her witness. Every tree that bent, every animal that howled, every gust of wind that carried her cries was part of a growing chorus. It was as if the land itself had sworn to remember what she endured, waiting for the moment when memory would turn into power and sorrow into fire. The night that became etched into memory began like so many others, with cruelty, sharp words, and the weight of humiliation pressing against the girl's fragile spirit. Her stepmother's voice had been especially cutting that evening, filled with scorn and bitterness. The chores had been endless, each one piled atop the other with no kindness in return. The girl's body ached, her hands blistered from scrubbing, her back sore from bending, yet it was not the labor that broke her. It was the deliberate sting of words, the mockery that stripped her dignity and left her heart exposed. That night, before the stars had fully scattered across the sky, she retreated to the small dim corner that served as her resting place. Her body trembled, not from cold but from the weight of sorrow pressing against her chest. She pressed her palms into her eyes as if she could stop the tears from spilling, but the dam had broken. What poured forth was not just sadness, it was despair so heavy, so raw, it seemed to seep into the air itself. Her sobs rose into the night, muffled at first, then breaking free in waves. Each tear that slipped down her cheeks fell into the dust, sinking into the soil with a quiet finality. The ground seemed to drink them eagerly as though thirsting for her pain. Her cries were not the shallow whimpers of a child seeking comfort, but deep, wrenching sobs that carried years of neglect, rejection, and injustice. The sound of her weeping was almost otherworldly, rising and falling like a chant of anguish that could pierce even the thickest silence. As the night deepened, a strange stillness began to spread. The usual chorus of crickets and cicadas faded until it was as though the very earth held its breath. Dogs that had been barking in the distance fell silent. The leaves that had been stirring faintly in the evening breeze grew utterly still, hanging frozen in the air. Even the river, not far from the house, seemed to quiet, its rippling waters smoothing as though pausing to listen. The girl's tears fell faster, soaking the ground beneath her. She did not notice the way the soil darkened, almost pulsing as it absorbed her grief. She did not see the faint shimmer that began to rise from the earth like mist, as if her sorrow carried power too great to remain hidden. Her pain was not only her own, it was being carried, echoed, and received by something greater. In that heavy silence, even the stars seemed sharper, their glow piercing the heavens with unusual clarity. The moon, half veiled by drifting clouds, shone pale light onto the ground where she knelt, casting her in a silver glow. The night had become an unwelcome witness, but a witness nonetheless, holding her despair with the gravity of an ancient secret. The stepmother, sleeping in her bed, turned restlessly but could not explain why she felt a strange heaviness pressing against her dreams. Villagers, too, shifted in their sleep, some muttering, some waking suddenly with pounding hearts as though they had heard something cry out in the distance. None could name what disturbed them, yet the stillness carried into their homes, unsettling their rest. The girl's sobs grew quieter, not because she had found relief, but because her body was spent. Her chest heaved, her breath ragged, her tears now falling in a steady stream without her even realizing. And yet, the silence around her only deepened, thick like a blanket, wrapping her grief into the air, the soil, the trees, the sky. She felt, for a moment, as though the world itself leaned in to hear her. She could not explain it, but in her despair she sensed the earth holding her sorrow, the night absorbing her cries, and something ancient stirring far beneath the surface. She thought herself alone, yet the truth was that nothing in creation had ignored her that night. The land itself had bowed in silence, honoring her grief, waiting to turn her despair into something that would one day burn bright with power. Her final sob broke into a whisper, her lips trembling as she pressed her forehead into the dirt. "Why must I suffer so?" she murmured, her words carried into the soil as though planting seeds of pain. She closed her eyes, unaware that the ground beneath her was no longer just dirt, it was alive with her sorrow, pulsing faintly with the promise of change. The stillness lingered long after her tears slowed, stretching into the darkest hours before dawn. Nature did not stir, as if guarding the sacred weight of her despair. The air, heavy and solemn, carried a quiet truth, nothing that had been witnessed that night would ever be forgotten. Her pain had been etched into the land, and though she did not yet know it, the forces that listened would rise in her defense when the time was right. That night was not simply one of sorrow, it was the turning point, when despair sank into the bones of the earth and awoke powers that had been silent for too long. That night, when her body was too weary for more tears and her breath had grown shallow from exhaustion, the girl slipped into a restless sleep. Yet it was not the sleep of escape or numbness, it was the sleep of one whose spirit was being carried into another realm. In her dreams, the darkness around her softened, no longer a prison but a vast and endless space where unseen forces stirred. The air felt alive, trembling with unseen whispers, as though voices that had been silent for generations were leaning close to speak. At first she thought she was only imagining it. The murmur sounded like the rustling of leaves in the wind or the shifting of river water over stones. But soon the whispers grew clearer, taking shape, forming words that seemed to echo both inside her mind and outside in the dreamscape. Her heart raced, and though fear pricked at her, she felt no threat in the voices. Instead there was warmth, ancient, steady, and unyielding. From the shadows emerged faint figures, glowing faintly with a light that pulsed like fireflies in the night. They were not solid like living flesh but shimmers of memory, faces she felt she recognized even if she could not name them. Some were men with wise eyes and tall bearing, others were women draped in garments that shimmered like woven smoke, their expressions a mixture of compassion and strength. They moved toward her slowly, surrounding her without menace, their presence filling her with a sense of belonging she had never known in her stepmother's home. One of them spoke first, a woman with hair that cascaded like a waterfall of light. Her voice was steady, echoing with centuries of wisdom. "Child, your tears are not wasted. They are seeds, and the earth has taken them into its keeping." The girl trembled, unable to find words, but her eyes widened as the spirit reached out, her hand hovering above the girl's chest where her heart beat rapidly. "Your sorrow has not weakened you. Every insult, every hunger, every cruelty you endured, these are not chains. They are firewood waiting for the flame." Another spirit stepped forward, an old man with deep lines etched across his glowing face. His eyes gleamed like embers as he said, "We have watched. Long before this night, we have seen how you endured what others would not survive. Each tear you shed has called to us. Each cry you thought was lost has been carried by the wind, the soil, and the river to our ears. None of it was in vain." The girl's lips trembled. "But I am weak," she whispered, her voice breaking in the dream as it had in waking life. "I cannot fight them. I cannot escape." The spirits' voices rose in a chorus, not harsh but insistent, wrapping her like a cloak of fire. "No, child. You are not weak. What you feel as weakness is the gathering of strength. Do you not see? Your pain has filled the earth. Your tears have awakened us. Even the silence of the night bowed to your sorrow. And now what has been gathered will rise within you." As they spoke, the dream shifted. She saw the ground where she had wept, glowing faintly as though each tear had become a spark buried in the soil. She saw rivers carrying whispers of her cries, trees leaning in as though listening, winds swirling to lift her pain into the sky. It was as if the whole world had conspired not to forget her suffering but to hold it in trust until it could return to her as strength. Her hands, which in waking life were raw and frail, appeared different in the dream. She saw them glowing faintly, power humming through them like veins of fire beneath the skin. Her reflection appeared in a pool of dream water, and she gasped. Her eyes shimmered with light, and though her body looked the same, there was an aura about her, a radiance that spoke of resilience forged in silence. The first woman spoke again, her tone both gentle and commanding. "When dawn comes, you will no longer be only a girl. You will be the vessel of all that has been denied you. Hunger will become power, tears will become flame, and sorrow will become the edge of your vengeance. No one who mocked your cries will escape the justice you carry." The spirits circled closer, their whispers filling her ears, weaving together like a song older than memory. They told her of courage hidden in her bones, of fire waiting in her breath, of storms waiting in her silence. They showed her visions of the stepmother who had tormented her, cowering before the very tears she once mocked. They showed her villagers trembling as they realized the one they starved, scorned, and abandoned was now the one who held the balance of their fates. The girl felt warmth surge through her chest, stronger than any fire she had known. For the first time she believed she was more than her suffering. Her sorrow was not a mark of defeat but a gathering of forces too great to remain hidden. As the dream faded, the spirits' voices echoed in unison, "Rise, child. No tear is wasted. They are weapons now and they are yours." When she stirred awake, the night was still dark, but something within her had changed. Her eyes no longer brimmed with despair but with an eerie, smoldering light. The whispers of her ancestors lingered in her ears, like the echo of a storm yet to break. She was no longer only a girl weeping in secret. She was a vessel of power, and her enemies would soon learn that her tears had not drowned her, they had armed her. The night was thick with silence when she opened her eyes again, though silence no longer felt like emptiness. It pressed against her skin, humming with a strange anticipation, as if the world itself held its breath for her. She lay for a moment, still and listening, her heart beating in rhythm with something far older than herself. Then she rose slowly from her bed, and in that instant, anyone watching would have sworn she was no longer the same girl who had wept herself into despair. Her body felt both heavy and light at once, as though the weight of centuries pressed on her shoulders, yet her steps carried her with a grace she had never known. Her face, once marked by exhaustion and sorrow, glowed faintly in the darkness. It was not the light of fire or moon, but something softer, stranger, an otherworldly radiance that seemed to flow from within her, seeping through her skin as though her very soul had learned to shine. When she touched her cheeks, she felt the dampness of tears still clinging there. But when one fell, rolling down the curve of her jaw and dropping to the earth, she gasped. It did not sink quietly into the dirt like before. Instead, it sizzled as it landed, a faint wisp of smoke curling upward. Where it struck, the ground bore a tiny scorch mark, a reminder that what once was only sorrow had become something sharper, something alive with flame. She lifted her trembling hand and caught another tear before it fell. It burned her palm, not with pain but with power. The heat seared lightly into her skin, leaving behind a faint glowing line like an ember's trail. She stared at it, stunned, and then another tear followed, this time spilling freely, striking the floor beside her mat. Each drop hissed and burned, leaving tiny blackened marks that smoked faintly in the dark hut. For a moment she thought she should be afraid. But no fear rose in her. Instead, there was only an overwhelming certainty that this was no curse. This was her inheritance, her sorrow returned to her as a weapon. The voices of the spirits still lingered in her ears, echoing, "No tear is wasted. They are weapons now and they are yours." She stood fully, her shadow stretching long against the mud walls, and her glow filled the hut as though dawn itself had slipped inside. Her hair shimmered faintly in the light, her eyes reflecting the embers within her tears. She looked at her hands again, flexing them slowly, and realized that her entire body seemed charged, as if every vein carried not just blood but fire waiting to be called. Outside, the village lay in sleep. Dogs stirred faintly, whining as though they sensed the change, their ears twitching nervously. Chickens shifted uneasily in their cages, and the leaves of the trees whispered without wind. Midnight had settled over the land, but it no longer belonged to shadows. It belonged to her. She stepped outside, the night air cool against her heated skin. The ground beneath her feet seemed to hum, as if the earth itself recognized her transformation. She walked barefoot through the dirt, and though she left no scorch marks with her steps, every tear that slipped free as she remembered her pain did not vanish. They burned softly where they landed, glowing faintly before fading into the ground, leaving behind a reminder that sorrow had been reborn as fire. Her face lifted toward the sky. The moon seemed to bow behind thin clouds, its pale light paling in comparison to the radiance of her spirit. She whispered into the darkness, not in prayer but in promise, "You will see me, all of you. You will learn what my tears have become." The wind stirred then, wrapping around her like a cloak. It carried the scent of ash and rain, as though the heavens themselves were bending toward her awakening. Somewhere in the village, a baby woke and began to cry, its voice sharp against the midnight stillness. Dogs barked once more, this time louder, restless, almost fearful. The air felt alive with tension, as if the spirits who had whispered to her in dreams were now standing unseen at her side. She touched her cheek again and let another tear fall deliberately, watching as it struck a dry stick at her feet. The tear hissed, and then to her astonishment, the stick glowed briefly, a faint ember sparking before fading into smoke. She inhaled sharply, her sorrow had indeed become flame. It would no longer be dismissed or mocked. The girl who had been humiliated, starved, and broken now stood in the center of the night like a living torch whose light did not consume her but armed her. Her glow was not bright enough to wake the whole village yet, but it was enough to mark the beginning of something that could not be undone. Midnight had been hers in despair many nights before, but this midnight was different. This was not a night of silence but a night of return. A return of her power, her dignity, her soul reforged in flame. She turned back toward the hut, her eyes narrowing. Within those walls she had known nothing but cruelty. Soon they would know her fire. Soon they would understand that tears which burn cannot be ignored. The land around her hushed once more, as though waiting for what she would do next. Midnight stretched on, long and tense, but she was no longer afraid of it. Midnight was the hour of her rebirth, and with each burning tear that touched the ground, the world was already changing. The hut sat in uneasy silence, a fragile shell of order that the stepmother had once believed unshakable. But tonight something was stirring, something she could not control. The girl, long confined to sorrow and tears, had risen with the power of forces far beyond human understanding. Even from a distance, the stepmother sensed the change, a subtle tremor in the floorboards that mirrored the tension in her chest. Inside the house, shadows began to stretch unnaturally, creeping along the walls as if drawn to the girl's returning energy. The faint glow that emanated from her tears seemed to seep through the cracks of the hut, twisting the familiar corners into ominous shapes. The wind outside stirred the eaves, but within, it felt as if the very walls were breathing, shivering with a forewarning of what was to come. Every object, from the simple clay pots to the coarse wooden furniture, seemed to quiver in anticipation, responding to a power no one in the room yet fully understood. The stepmother paced restlessly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had dismissed the girl's cries before, had mocked her for her weakness, but tonight was different. Each faint echo of the girl's sobs seemed to penetrate the walls, carrying with it a strange heat that prickled her skin. She drew back her hand as if struck by a sudden flame when the sound intensified. It was not fire, not yet, but the sensation burned her nonetheless, leaving goosebumps and terror in its wake. Her accomplices shifted uneasily beside her, sensing the change too late to escape its first warning. The first signs were small but undeniable. Food left out for the household animals spoiled instantly, curdling and stinking before anyone could react. Grain in the sacks blackened, its surface crawling with smoke that dissipated into thin wisps as if alive. The stepmother's wine and water turned acrid, souring on the table in a manner that defied explanation. She clutched at her robes in panic, realizing that the house itself seemed to be rebelling against her cruelty. Then came the tremors. The floorboards groaned, bending and shifting slightly beneath their weight. The walls, which had been steady for decades, developed faint cracks that snaked up from the corners like creeping vines. With each heartbeat, the cracks widened imperceptibly, and small pebbles from the roof rattled down. The stepmother froze, staring at them as if their movement were a direct attack, and in many ways it was. Every time the girl's faint cry echoed from beyond the door, her presence now imbued with unearthly energy, the heat searing the stepmother's skin intensified. It was not localized, but it seemed to spread through her entire body, as if the anger, sorrow, and fury the girl had endured had become a tangible force. She swayed slightly, her mind racing and yet paralyzed, understanding only vaguely that she had unleashed something she could neither command nor contain. The shadows on the walls grew bolder. A flicker in the corner suggested a human figure, but it was not quite human. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, stretching and bending in impossible ways. Her heart leapt into her throat. Even the firelight she had trusted to warm the room seemed hesitant, flickering as though acknowledging a power far beyond her comprehension. The stepmother's breaths came in shallow gasps, and her minions exchanged fearful glances, their usual arrogance replaced by terror that gnawed at their confidence. Every object in the room became a messenger of impending retribution. Pots clattered without touch, chairs rocked slightly as though with invisible weight, and the coarse mat she had forced the girl to sleep upon quivered as if restless. Even the very air seemed thick, vibrating with a pressure that made each inhale a conscious effort. The stepmother's attempts to speak or command the room failed. Her voice faltered, swallowed by the oppressive aura that had settled into every corner. It was not just the house that trembled. Her conscience, long dulled by greed and cruelty, began to stir under the heat of justice made manifest. Every secret lie, every cruel deed, seemed to echo back at her in the strange resonance of the room. The girl's tears, though distant, had begun to burn the walls themselves, each drop a silent herald of power returned upon the guilty. From outside, the wind howled against the eaves, but inside, the tremors and cracks dominated. Each time the stepmother flinched, imagining the girl advancing closer, she felt a flash of warmth or searing pain along her arms and neck, a phantom burn that left her skin prickling and red. She backed away from the walls, only to feel them flex, as if the house itself were alive and siding with the girl who had suffered for so long. By midnight, the house no longer felt safe to those who had oppressed the innocent. The shadows had lengthened to the point where corners seemed bottomless, objects shifted unpredictably, and the air thrummed with the latent energy of the girl's unseen presence. Even if she did not yet appear fully, the stepmother knew instinctively that the tide had turned. Every creak of the floor, every flicker of shadow, every inexplicable movement of objects was a testament to a power she could neither anticipate nor survive. And in the midst of it all, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper seemed to whine through the walls, a voice that carried the faint heat of vengeance. Your cruelty has awakened the fire. The night has answered, and it belongs to her. The stepmother's eyes widened in terror as she realized that this night would not end with silence or sleep. The house trembled with the weight of justice, and the girl, though still unseen, had already begun to burn her legacy away, one silent, searing warning at a time. By the first whispers of dawn, the house had become a living monument to retribution. No nail, no wall, no object stood untouched by the trembling echo of the girl's fury. And though she had not yet fully revealed herself, the stepmother and her accomplices understood with chilling clarity that their reign of cruelty was collapsing from within, as if the spirits themselves had risen to aid the innocent, their power concentrated through the girl who had cried herself into vengeance. The girl's sobs grew heavier as the night deepened, each tear that fell carrying the weight of years of cruelty, neglect, and torment. But these were no ordinary tears. They shimmered faintly in the darkness, glowing like molten embers as they traced the curves of her cheeks and dripped onto the cold, worn floor beneath her. Each drop hit the ground with a sizzling whisper, as though the very earth recognized the injustice she had endured and began to answer in kind. The walls, once steadfast and unyielding, seemed to quiver at the touch of these tears, their wooden beams warming and humming with a subtle, foreboding energy. At first, the stepmother and her accomplices thought it was imagination, a trick of the dim candlelight and the shadows dancing across the room. But soon the faint glow became a creeping radiance, spreading across the floor and climbing the walls. The mats on which the girl had been forced to sit and sleep began to smoke, curling at the edges as the heat of her sorrow manifested into something tangible, something that could no longer be ignored. The smell of scorched fiber and wood began to fill the hut, sharp and acrid, and panic rose like a tide in the hearts of those who had caused her so much pain. The stepmother's eyes widened with terror as she witnessed the transformation. Each tear that struck the ground seemed to carry an internal flame, invisible yet impossibly potent, igniting the air itself. Her accomplices tried to extinguish the first wisps of smoke with crude motions, stamping the mats and throwing water, but their efforts were futile. The girl's anguish was a force that transcended their mortal attempts to control it. Her tears were no longer just expressions of sorrow, they were instruments of retribution, each drop a spark ready to ignite the consequences of cruelty. The fire spread with a life of its own. The thatched roof hissed and popped as tiny flames licked at the edges, chasing the smoke upwards. The walls glowed with streaks of fiery veins as though the house itself had absorbed the girl's pain and was now channeling it into a physical, blazing reckoning. Every object that had once symbolized her suffering, the heavy cooking pots, the coarse mats, the chairs she had polished only to be mocked, now became fuel for the inferno, feeding the flames that danced and twisted in response to her tears. From her vantage point, the girl felt an astonishing surge of power coursing through her. Each tear seemed to amplify her connection with the spirits that had guided her, the ancestral forces that had whispered to her in dreams and filled her heart with courage. The burning was not merely destructive, it was purifying. It cleansed the house of cruelty, turning every corner that had once imprisoned her sorrow into a monument of justice made manifest. The heat pressed against the faces of her enemies, forcing them to recoil, stumbling backward as if invisible hands were pushing them away from the source of their long-overdue reckoning. The stepmother screamed, realizing too late that her past deeds had summoned this disaster. Every insult, every lash, every stolen moment of comfort from the girl had become fuel for the blaze now consuming her home. The air was thick with smoke, carrying a bitter scent that stung their eyes and filled their lungs, but there was no escaping the invisible grip of justice now manifested. The flames, guided by the girl's tears, did not burn indiscriminately, they spared no detail of cruelty, yet seemed to leave untouched any remnants of kindness or innocence that had once resided in the hut. As the inferno roared, the villagers outside began to notice. The glow from the windows cast shadows that leapt across the compound, painting the surrounding grounds in hues of orange and red. Fear and awe gripped them simultaneously. Whispers spread quickly. The girl, once meek and tormented, had returned not just to confront her oppressors but to wield the raw power of her suffering, channeling it into a force that none could resist. They saw the flames as both punishment and protection, a divine reckoning for cruelty endured too long. Inside, the girl remained composed even as the fire surged. She understood that her tears, once silent symbols of despair, had become instruments of cosmic balance. Each drop burned with the memory of every insult, every deprivation, every act of violence inflicted upon her, yet also carried the wisdom and guidance of the spirits who had nurtured her strength in the darkness. As the fire consumed the physical trappings of her oppression, she felt lighter, freer, and more in command of her destiny than ever before. By midnight, the hut was fully alight, flames licking the rafters and walls, twisting and curling like serpents of judgment. The stepmother and her accomplices stumbled in panic, realizing that their home, once a fortress of dominance, was now a cage of their own undoing. The girl's tears, imbued with the spirit's guidance, continued to fall, each strike against the wood and earth sending tremors through the structure, turning sorrow into fiery retribution. Every spark was a reminder that cruelty, when directed at the innocent, invites consequences beyond human comprehension. Even as the house burned, the girl's figure was radiant against the blaze, a symbol of endurance and wrath merged. Her tears, now transformed into streams of fire, illuminated her face, casting shadows that danced with the wisdom and power she had gained. She did not celebrate the destruction with malice. It was a reckoning, a release, a tangible demonstration that injustice, no matter how deep or hidden, could never prevail against courage, resilience, and the guidance of higher forces. The night carried on, echoing with the crackle of the fire and the fearful cries of the stepmother and her minions. Villagers, standing at safe distances, whispered among themselves, awestruck by the display of power and justice. They understood that the girl had returned not as a victim but as a force that no mortal cruelty could subdue. Her tears had burned not just the house but the very foundation of oppression, leaving behind a clear message. Those who harm the innocent will face consequences far beyond their imagining. By the first light of dawn, the house smoldered, the air thick with the scent of ash and burnt wood. The girl, standing tall and resolute, watched as her oppressors cowered, their authority undone, their cruelty turned against them. The flames had passed, but the lesson endured. Her suffering had transformed into power, her tears had become fire, and justice, at last, had been served. At the first light of dawn, the village awoke to a scene both chilling and awe-inspiring. Where the stepmother's house had stood, there remained only a smoldering skeleton of wood and ash, blackened remnants twisted by fire, yet amid the devastation the girl stood unscathed. Her clothes were untouched by soot, her hair unburned, her eyes calm and radiant with a strange, commanding light. The villagers, who had watched from a safe distance through the night, approached cautiously, their mouths agape, unable to fully comprehend what they had witnessed. Fear, reverence, and astonishment mingled in the crisp morning air, for they realized that the young girl they had once seen as fragile and helpless now radiated a presence that commanded respect and even awe. Her face bore the serenity of someone who had endured unimaginable suffering yet had emerged not only alive but strengthened. Each step she took across the ash-strewn ground seemed to assert her authority, and the villagers instinctively stepped aside, as if honoring an unspoken power that had taken residence in her. Children, who had once been taught to mock her weakness, now stared in wonder, whispering among themselves about the magical force that must have protected her. Elders, who had always scolded their young ones for disobedience and cruelty, now nodded gravely, acknowledging that they had underestimated the consequences of mistreating the innocent. News of the fiery night spread quickly, carried from village to village. Travelers spoke in hushed tones about the girl whose tears had ignited justice itself, transforming sorrow into a weapon of cosmic balance. The story became a moral compass for the land. No longer could cruelty toward the innocent be dismissed as trivial or inconsequential. Farmers paused in their fields to recount the tale to their children. Merchants told it to those who passed through the marketplaces. Even neighboring villages, previously skeptical of such matters, whispered of the girl who had become both a protector and a warning. The girl herself remained composed, her demeanor neither boastful nor vindictive. She walked through the village calmly, offering quiet gestures of reassurance to those who feared that more disaster might follow. Yet, the memory of her suffering was etched into her presence. The villagers could sense that while she had shown mercy by not harming them unnecessarily, the power that had erupted from her tears was neither to be taken lightly nor forgotten. Every glance, every step, carried the weight of experience, teaching silently that kindness should never be met with cruelty. The stepmother and her accomplices, now absent from the village, had become symbols of a cautionary tale. Their greed, envy, and malice had invited an extraordinary form of justice. and their absence was a constant reminder to all who had witnessed the events that mistreating the innocent could summon forces beyond human understanding. Mothers and fathers used the story to discipline their children, emphasizing that tormenting the weak and vulnerable could lead to unimaginable consequences. The girl, though still young, had become the embodiment of this lesson, a living testament to the power of innocence and resilience. Villagers began to rebuild, but the memory of the fire and the girl's miraculous survival remained alive in every corner of the community. They spoke of her with a mixture of fear and reverence, noting the change in their perceptions. Those who had once ignored her suffering now sought her presence, hoping to understand the mystery behind the power that had protected her. Even the natural world seemed to acknowledge her triumph. The winds that had once carried whispers during her suffering now felt softer, more respectful, as if the earth itself recognized the balance that had been restored. As days turned into weeks, the girl's story became more than a local legend. It became a moral anchor. Her tears, once signs of helplessness, had become instruments of justice. People began to see that suffering, when endured with patience and integrity, could yield strength that surpassed any human cruelty. The lesson was clear. Those who oppress the innocent invite consequences that are both immediate and enduring, and those who endure hardship with grace can transform pain into power. The girl, standing among the ashes, silently promised herself that she would use her newfound strength not for further vengeance, but to guide and protect. Her life had become a symbol, her survival and power a constant warning to the cruel, a beacon of hope for the vulnerable. Her story reminded everyone that kindness and innocence are not weaknesses to be exploited. They are forces that, when threatened unjustly, can awaken unimaginable power. From that dawn onward, the village never forgot the girl who had endured the unbearable, whose tears had burned away injustice, and whose presence reminded all that morality and cosmic balance could not be defied. She became the living lesson, a narrative passed down from parent to child, neighbor to neighbor, forever illustrating that the smallest and gentlest among us can wield the greatest strength when their innocence is violated, and that fire, whether literal or metaphorical, will always find its way to those who deserve it. The legend of the girl spread beyond the village, inspiring countless others to uphold justice, protect the innocent, and respect the unseen forces that govern the balance of life. Her tale was simple yet profound. Cruelty toward the weak carries consequences far beyond what the human eye can see, and those who endure suffering with courage, patience, and integrity will emerge stronger, wiser, and honored. The girl had transformed pain into power, tears into a lesson, and despair into hope, forever leaving her mark as the living embodiment of justice.